There comes a moment, quiet, subtle, but deeply unsettling, when you realize that someone no longer sees you the same way. It could be a spouse, a friend, a grown child, or even a colleague you once trusted. The warmth that used to flow between you becomes cool, measured. They respond slower. You notice it in their eyes, in the way they speak your name, if they use it at all. It's not just distance, it's indifference. And indifference, as Nietzsche understood, is more brutal than hate. Nietzsche believed that the will to power, the innate drive in every human to assert, express and define themselves, is central to our psychological health. When someone no longer values us, they are denying our presence in their symbolic world. They are saying in subtle ways, "You no longer have influence here." This is deeply destabilizing because we are at our core meaning-making creatures. To be dismissed is to feel meaningless. For many people in midlife or later, particularly in a culture like the US, where individual worth is so tightly linked to usefulness, productivity, and youth, this experience can trigger a silent crisis. You gave your best years to relationships, families, companies, and now suddenly your voice echoes in empty corridors. The worst part? You begin to believe it's your fault. Nietzsche would urge you to reject that internalized shame. He would say, "They do not define your value, you do. Their inability to see your worth is not a verdict. It's a mirror, reflecting their own limits, not your inadequacy." And here comes the trick. It's deceptively simple but radically difficult. Withdraw your need for validation from those who withhold it, and redirect your will inward. Stop begging for scraps of attention. Let go of the exhausting need to be seen by someone who chooses blindness. In doing so, you reclaim your power. This is not passive withdrawal. This is active transformation. It is the beginning of what Nietzsche called becoming who you are. When someone stops valuing you, a common emotional reflex kicks in: resentment. It's subtle at first, a tightening in your chest, a sting when they dismiss your ideas, a bitterness you carry quietly. Over time, that emotion grows roots. And if left unchecked, it becomes a permanent filter through which you see not only that person, but yourself. Nietzsche warned us about this. In his exploration of morality and human nature, he introduced the concept of ressentiment, a deep, festering resentment born not just from pain, but from powerlessness. According to him, when we feel undervalued and cannot retaliate directly or reclaim our dignity, we internalize the pain. We begin to construct narratives that justify our suffering. They are cruel, they are shallow. I am the noble one. It's a seductive form of self-protection. But here's the catch. Resentment keeps us small. It chains us to the very people and systems we feel wronged by. We continue to orbit them emotionally, even as we try to pretend we've moved on. That person who dismissed you, they still control your internal world, not because they're powerful, but because your resentment gives them rent-free space in your mind. The challenge then is not just to walk away, but to walk away clean. Nietzsche didn't believe in forgiveness as a moral obligation. Instead, he advocated for the revaluation of values, taking back the authority to define what matters. When someone no longer values you, ask yourself, why did I allow my worth to be so tied to their gaze? Not as a form of blame, but as an act of liberation. Resentment is an emotional tax you no longer need to pay. What would it look like to live without it? To replace it with a quiet, defiant clarity. To say, not to them, but to yourself, I see who I am even if you don't, and that is enough. This clarity isn't just freeing, it's transformative, because the moment you release resentment, you reclaim your emotional real estate. Most people think of power in dramatic terms, raised voices, ultimatums, or visible control. But in reality, power in relationships often shifts silently. It happens in glances not returned, messages left unread, invitations that never come. Over time, the emotional balance tilts, and if you're not paying close attention, you may find yourself begging for crumbs from a table you once helped build. Nietzsche saw power not as domination, but as self-expression. The ability to shape your world through will, through clarity, through presence. When someone no longer values you, what's often happening is a withdrawal of recognition, not of truth. They stop recognizing your voice, your insight, your emotional weight in the dynamic. And if you internalize that withdrawal, you reinforce their distorted view. Here's the shift. Power doesn't vanish. It just migrates. When someone steps back, they're handing you an unexpected gift, the space to redefine the relationship on your terms. But most people miss this chance. They react with anxiety, seeking to reattach to prove their worth again. They try harder, speak softer, compromise more. But Nietzsche would challenge that impulse. He would say, "Why are you trying to resurrect something that's already told you it no longer holds your value?" The real trick, the profound psychological maneuver, is this. Don't chase, recenter. Withdraw not just your actions, but your emotional investment. Step out of the dynamic and re-enter your own inner space. This isn't coldness, it's restoration. And when you do this, something surprising happens. The power they assumed they held begins to dissipate, because the true source of your influence was never their recognition. It was your presence, your steadiness, your self-respect. Power doesn't come from being wanted. It comes from knowing that your worth doesn't fluctuate based on who decides to acknowledge it. When you hold that truth, relationships stop being battlegrounds. They become mirrors. And sometimes, the clearest reflection comes after someone turns away. Detachment is often misunderstood. To many, it sounds like giving up, becoming cold or indifferent. But true detachment, the kind Nietzsche hinted at in his call to transcend ordinary human reactions, is not about turning off your heart. It's about reclaiming the space where your heart has been repeatedly wounded. When someone no longer values you, your first instinct may be to fight for that connection. This is especially true for those who grew up in environments where love had to be earned. You try harder, love louder, prove more. But this creates a trap. The more effort you give to someone who devalues you, the more you erode your own dignity. Your actions become not acts of love, but survival strategies. Nietzsche encourages us to embrace the discomfort of pulling back, not as revenge, but as a form of self-honesty. Detachment is the radical choice to stop forcing alignment where there is none. It's saying, if you cannot see me clearly, I will not distort myself to remain visible. This doesn't mean closing your heart to all connection. Quite the opposite. It means you stop anchoring your emotional well-being to the unpredictability of others. You begin to live from a place that doesn't depend on external validation. That's not coldness, that's clarity. American culture often rewards emotional overextension. The parent who gives too much, the partner who endures too long, the friend who keeps forgiving. But what if we saw boundaries as sacred rather than selfish? What if pulling back from someone who diminishes you isn't the end of love, but the beginning of a different kind of respect for both of you? Nietzsche's idea of becoming who you are isn't passive. It requires strength, discernment, and the willingness to walk alone when necessary. Detachment is the foundation, not detachment from feeling, but from the need to be chosen in order to feel worthy. There is a deep peace that comes when you stop reaching, when you realize that your value isn't proved through pain, but through presence, steady, rooted, and finally, free. There's a subtle, almost invisible contract we make in many relationships. If I make myself indispensable, I will be loved. We cook, we care, we remember birthdays, we fix problems before they're even noticed. We offer parts of ourselves freely, hoping that our usefulness will translate into permanence. But Nietzsche would call this a self-imposed servitude, masked as virtue. In the United States, particularly among older generations, there's a cultural pride in being reliable, the one who never lets others down. For many, it was how love was earned in childhood and how identity was built in adulthood. But here lies the danger. When your worth is built on being needed, the moment you are no longer needed, you risk feeling worthless. This illusion is dangerous, because being needed is not the same as being valued. One is transactional. I need you to do this for me. The other is relational. I see you for who you are. When someone no longer needs you and you feel yourself unraveling, it reveals just how deeply your self-worth was tied to function, not essence. Nietzsche invites us to confront this with brutal honesty. He challenges the idea that sacrifice equals virtue. He calls us to ask, who am I when I am no longer useful to others? This is not a call to become selfish. It's a call to become sovereign, to shift from being a tool in someone else's life to being the author of your own. The truth is, many people will take your efforts for granted, not out of malice, but because they were never taught to recognize quiet devotion. That is their limitation, not your failure. So here's the pivot. Instead of seeking to be needed, practice being whole. Let your presence, not your service, be the gift. You are not valuable because of what you do for others. You are valuable, full stop. And if someone fails to see that, it's not your job to convince them. It's your cue to return home to yourself. When someone no longer values you, the story often starts to write itself, quietly, cruelly, and without your input. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I changed. Maybe I should have tried harder. It's a loop, fed by silence and unanswered questions. And the longer you stay in that loop, the more your self-perception begins to fracture. Nietzsche fiercely rejected inherited narratives, those given to us by culture, religion, or others' expectations. He believed in the necessity of self-authorship, taking control of your story, not by rewriting the past, but by reframing its meaning. The truth is, when someone devalues you, they're not just pulling away from you. They're trying to redefine who you are, often without your permission. But here's the thing, you don't owe anyone access to your identity, especially not those who can no longer handle your truth. In American life, where identity is often built on roles, mother, worker, caregiver, provider, a shift in how someone sees you can feel like an existential blow. But Nietzsche would remind us, you are not those roles. You are the force behind them, the consciousness, the will. Reclaiming the narrative means stepping out of the other person's frame and returning to your own. Instead of asking, why don't they value me? Ask, why did I give them the pen to write my worth? This isn't about pretending the pain didn't happen. It's about refusing to let the pain define the next chapter. The way someone treats you is data, not destiny. It reflects their perception, not your truth. And maybe the most radical thing you can do isn't to confront them, or explain yourself, or make them understand. Maybe the most radical thing is to quietly revise the narrative and walk forward, not with bitterness, but with authorship. Because in the end, no one else gets to decide what your story means, especially not someone who's already chosen to stop reading it. Self-respect isn't a feeling, it's a practice, a discipline. And in moments when you are no longer valued by someone, it becomes your only compass. When Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch, the ideal human who creates their own values and lives beyond herd morality, he wasn't glorifying arrogance. He was pointing toward a form of inner discipline, one where your self-worth is no longer dependent on how others treat you, but on the quiet daily decision to honor your own existence. This is especially important in midlife and beyond, when many people feel invisible. In American culture, where youth is idealized and productivity defines value, those who have spent decades giving to others, raising families, managing careers, maintaining marriages, often find themselves overlooked. Their contributions are no longer praised, and worse, they may be taken for granted. But self-respect demands a different stance. It says, even if you no longer see me, I still see myself. It's not about ego or pride. It's about protecting the inner dignity that's been forged through years of effort, sacrifice, and resilience. Practicing self-respect means you stop explaining yourself to people who aren't listening. You stop shrinking in spaces where your presence isn't honored. And you stop waiting for someone to offer you what you've already earned. There's a quiet power in this, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. You begin to dress for yourself, speak for yourself, make decisions not based on who will approve, but based on what aligns with your truth. And this changes the dynamic entirely. Because the person who no longer values you, they can no longer hurt you in the same way. Not because they've changed, but because you have. You're no longer waiting at the door for their validation. You've already walked through your own. Nietzsche believed that to live with strength is to affirm life as it is. even its rejections, and to affirm yourself despite those rejections. That's not defiance, that's freedom. There is a moment, often after loss, rejection, or betrayal, when you stop reaching outward and begin looking inward. It doesn't come easily. In fact, it usually arrives after you've exhausted every attempt to be seen, loved, or understood by someone who has already turned away. But in that stillness, something else emerges: yourself. Nietzsche believed that our highest task was not to be loved, accepted, or even understood, but to become who we truly are. Not who we were taught to be, not who others needed us to be, but the self that has been whispering beneath the noise for decades. When someone no longer values you, it may feel like a death, and in some ways it is. It's the death of who you were in their eyes. But Nietzsche invites us to embrace that death, not as an end, but as a necessary shedding. Only through the loss of false attachments do we awaken the will to self-creation. For Americans entering later stages of life, this can be an invitation, not a punishment. You have the wisdom now, you've lived enough to know what doesn't work. And you're finally in a position to stop performing for people who never truly saw you. This final trick, then, isn't a trick at all. It's a return to your own voice, your own rhythm, your own truth. You don't need to be angry to be free. You don't need to be perfect to be whole. You simply need to stop waiting for others to confirm who you already are. And here's the beauty. When you detach from those who undervalue you, you create space for those who will meet you in your fullness. People who are not intimidated by your strength, your depth, your boundaries, but drawn to them. In Nietzsche's words, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Perhaps that loss, that dismissal, was the beginning of your becoming. Not the end of your story, but the beginning of the truest chapter yet. There is a particular kind of pain that lingers long after a relationship fades, the pain of being misunderstood. You tried to communicate, to express your heart with clarity and honesty, but they didn't hear you. Or worse, they twisted your intentions into something small, selfish, or cold. And now, you're left not only with distance, but with distortion. This is where Nietzsche's wisdom becomes especially sharp. He reminds us that to live authentically, to become who you truly are, often means to walk alone, misunderstood, even criticized. He wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." In other words, those who do not understand your growth will interpret it as a threat or as abandonment. But here's the truth most people avoid. Being misunderstood is not a failure. It's often a sign that you're evolving beyond someone else's framework. In American culture, where politeness and emotional suppression often masquerade as harmony, being direct about your needs can be seen as rude. Setting boundaries can be labeled as cold. Choosing yourself can be mistaken for selfishness. But Nietzsche would challenge all of that. He would say, let them think what they will. Your task is not to be understood by everyone, but to be true to yourself. It takes immense strength to be misunderstood and still remain kind, to continue to live with openness even when others have closed themselves off from your truth. But that is where real character is forged, not in the applause, but in the silence. Not in the approval, but in the steady beat of your own conviction. You may never get to explain your side. You may never receive the apology or acknowledgement, but you don't need it to be whole. The one who misunderstands you may remain in the old story. But you are already living a new one. Being misunderstood doesn't mean you failed to communicate. Sometimes it means the other person refused to grow with you. And in that gap, between how they see you and who you've become, is the space where your future unfolds. It's where your values deepen, your inner voice strengthens, and your peace begins to outweigh your need to be seen. To walk that path without resentment, to carry your truth without permission, that is no longer survival. That is transcendence.